Welcome to our virtual event for the second half of the Recovered Book series, which is the launch of Gentleman Overboard by Herbert Clyde Lewis. Tonight, we'll learn about the process of rediscovery, gone through by Brad Bigelow, the instigator and coordinator, the captain of our ship, if you will, of the Recovered Book series, before having the pleasure of being joined by a roster of esteemed guests, including a pre-recorded conversation with Diego Donofrio from La Bestia Equilatera Press in Buenos Aires, and a live conversation with author Paul Willets and chief librarian for the city of Billings, Montana, Gavin Walcher. So before we do depart, albeit a little bit late on our maiden voyage, there's one piece of housekeeping to attend to. If I could ask that you all type any questions that you'd like to put to the guests into the YouTube live comment section, as I'll be forwarding them on to our speakers from there. We hope this evening's introduction and subsequent conversation will spark your interest in this forgotten classic and provide you with a peek through the porthole of the Recovered Book series. Both titles, What Katie Did by Susan Coolidge and Gentleman Overboard by Herbert Clyde Lewis, are now available to order on our website, www.boilerhouse.press. So without any further ado, and with a final all aboard, I'll hand over to you, Brad.
Thanks so much, James, and thank everybody for joining us. I'm going to start by giving you a little talk about Herbert Clyde Lewis, the author, and how we got to this point in rediscovering Gentleman Overboard, and then we'll have a little video clip with the interview with the first publisher to bring him back into today's world, which is from La Bestia Equilatera in Buenos Aires. But without further ado, let me go ahead and, okay. So 1937, Herbert Clyde Lewis wrote a novel about a man who fell overboard and was soon forgotten. At the time, I'm sure he had little idea that he was going to suffer the same fate just a few years later. Herbert Clyde Lewis's story in some ways is a typical American success story, or at least it should have been. His mother Clara and his father Hyman emigrated to America in the 1890s, part of the great wave of Jewish immigrants from the Pale of Settlement in Russia. They settled in Brownsville, a neighborhood in Brooklyn that at the time was the largest community of Jewish immigrants outside of Europe. Clara and Hyman tried to Americanize their sons by giving them good Anglo-Saxon names of Alfred Joseph, Herbert Clyde, and Benjamin George. Years later, Lewis wrote a nostalgic piece for the Los Angeles Times in which he called Brownsville the greatest miracle that ever visited the earth, pointing out that it was essentially a quintessential American melting pot myth. But the fact was that he couldn't wait to get out of there as fast as possible. And so by the early 1930s, when he was just a young man, he got on a ship and went to Shanghai, China, where he worked for several years as a newspaper reporter. He then came back to New York in 1933, got married, and he went to work as a reporter for the Herald Tribune and other papers. He tried a little bit of writing on his own. He published a few magazine fictions, which are kind of classic stereotype adventure stories from that period. And then in 1937, he published his first novel, Gentleman Overboard. Later, he said he got the idea for the book as he was standing on the roof of his apartment. He was thinking, how could a man bridge that mental gap between the security under his feet and that world down there? In other words, what happens to a man's mind when suddenly all the basis of his security are suddenly taken away? And that's certainly the situation that Preston Standish finds himself in when he falls off the ship in the Pacific. But the truth was, Lewis himself wasn't in a particularly secure position at the time. The very same month this book came out, he declared bankruptcies, and the only asset he had, in fact, were the expected royalties from this book. He was rescued by an offer of a job working for MGM Studios in Hollywood. The truth is, even though he made quite a bit of money, Lewis hated that job because he got assigned to what we would call B movies today. And in fact, most of his screen credits from this period are a few really awful B movies starring a boy singer named Bobby Breen. So he went back to New York and he went to work on his second novel, Spring Offensive. It takes place in the no man's land during the so-called phony war that existed between the Allied and German armies in the winter from 1939 to 1940. The book itself came out in the first week of May 1940. Here you can see a review from that week. And of course, the problem was that 4 days later, the German army invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands in the Blitzkrieg, and nobody was particularly interested in an anti-war book that took place on a front that no longer existed. So Lewis decided to move his family to a quiet town of Provincetown, Massachusetts, to work on his third novel, Seasoned Greeting, which came out in 1941. It's a wonderful Christmas story set in a New York rooming house full of lost souls and down-to-outers. But again, his timing was terrible. As you can see in this example, his story, his book came out the first week of December. The reviews hit literally, in this case, from the Brooklyn Herald. It came out the day before Pearl Harbor. And after the Japanese attack, of course, few people were in the interest of buying books about Christmas. Once again, Lewis was saved by a call from Hollywood. This time it was 20th Century Fox, who bought the film rights to one of his stories called Two-Time Quilligan, which came out a couple of years later as Don Juan Quilligan, another forgettable movie. Again, Lewis hated the experience of working in Hollywood. He felt he was just paying off his debts and that the work was keeping him from growing as a writer. He did, however, earn an Oscar nomination for his work on the story for the movie It Happened on Fifth Avenue, which, by the way, is a pretty good film. Nice Christmas story. And through his friend Dalton Trumbull, Lewis became involved in the Screenwriters Guild, joining the staff of its magazine in January 1947. Once again, great timing, because he became a vocal supporter of the progressive movement among the screenwriters and actors and union workers in Hollywood, just at the time it was starting to become accused as being a front for communism. And in fact, later that year, 10 of Lewis's colleagues, including Trumbo, were imprisoned for refusing to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee. And Lewis himself was blacklisted and was banned from working in the studios. Unable to get work in Hollywood, he moved back to New York, this time alone without his family, and once again, he declared bankruptcy. And not long after he moved back to Hollywood, he was found dead in a hotel room in the Hotel Earl across the street from Washington Park in Greenwich Village. He left behind a son, his wife, Gita, his son, Michael, and his daughter, Jane. At this point, only Michael is still alive to see his father's book come back to print. And with that, for almost 60 years, all trace of Herbert Clyde Lewis and his books faded from sight. So let's fast forward to 2008 or 9. After stumbling across Time Magazine's review of the book from back in 1937, I bought a copy of it and I wrote about it on my Neglected Books website. Not long after that, Diego D'Onofrio, a publisher from La Bestia Equilatera, a publisher based in Buenos Aires, contacted me and asked for suggestions about neglected books that they might publish in translation. And we'll talk about that in a couple of moments. You'll see that interview. And they published the book in 2010, and mostly by word of mouth, but also from some press. Over the course of a number of years, it spread throughout the Spanish-speaking world and received numerous enthusiastic reviews. About the same time, through an acquaintance between one of the publishers at La Bestia and Uriel Cohn, who was the publisher of Zicket Books in Israel at the time, Uriel heard about the book, read it, got excited about it, and it was translated into Hebrew and published in Israel. And once again, it became a cult classic. In fact, Uriel pointed out that this book sold around 5,000 copies in Israel, which is a phenomenal success for literary fiction in that small country. And then last year, it was translated into Dutch and published in the Netherlands. And so now, once again, it was, of course, acclaimed as an existential masterpiece, which it is. And now, after 84 years, we're rescuing it for English language readers. And so we invite you to join, as you have, in the rediscovery of Herbert Clyde Lewis's little masterpiece. It's coming out. It's out now, actually, in paperback, ebook, and audiobook versions. And it initiates our new series, Recovered Books. And with that, I'll break for a moment and we'll watch a short recorded interview with Diego D'Onofrio to talk about the impact this book made among Spanish-speaking readers. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Gentlemen Overboard, and particularly about its response among readers in all the countries served by La Bestia. So tell us, how did you come to first learn about Gentlemen Overboard?
First, thanks, Brad, for your invitation. I'm an old follower of your blog, Neglected Books. In these sites, there are hundreds of recommended books, and it's difficult to choose one in particular to publish. But I was helped by a communication I had with you, Brad, via email. I ask you, if you have to recommend one book to me, which one would you choose? I remember your words about Gentlemen Overboard. It has a strong narrative line that should grab more readers very quickly. I bought it and read it, and I love it immediately, and we decided to publish it. I want to highlight the extraordinary work of the translator, Laura Wittner, who made the book more vivid, close, as if it had been written yesterday and in Argentina.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. Now, what about the book made you think that it was worth translating and publishing, since it was such an unknown title?
Gentlemen Overboard has a great virtue that makes it current, modern, and attractive for today. It is an existential novel with the best narrative structure. The great discovery of this book, I think, is to have found a very intense narrative scene. Someone who fell from the ship and is left alone in the middle of the sea. It's a dramatic situation, extreme, the perfect justification to review and question an entire life. The protagonist Standish found in his wallet all the elements to connect him to his past. So that memory of his life sounds very natural and not forced.
Mm-hmm.
Standish also remembers the moments recently lived on the ship and asks to himself an important question. Who of his fellow travelers will notice his absence and give the alert for his rescue? That question is what makes it very interesting, the analysis of each of the characters that travel on the ship. Gentleman Overboard has a very attractive combination. Existential literature, almost autobiographical, but with a classic narrative development. Autobiographical novels that are in fashion nowadays seems like self-help books with a very flimsy, yes, with a very flimsy narrative
Yes.
structure. Gentleman Overboard is the opposite, very existential, while still being a great narrative work.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like the fact that you highlight, the fact that he thinks in his mind, who's going to remember me? Because that seems to be one of the things that makes this book so universal in its message, is that, that kind of thought probably occurs to everybody many times in the course of our lives. What is it we're doing and who will remember us? So I mean, I think that's for me, that's one of the things that I responded to when I read the book the very first time. Was there anything special that you had to consider in presenting the book to your audience?
Being Gentleman Overboard, such an excellent novel, easy to read, very gripping. I think you have to try to deliver it to the literature blogs, Instagrammers, and of course, without neglecting the newspapers. I hope your new edition of this book ends up being recommended one by one, very slowly. I think you have to be patient. Yes. Literary workshops, reading groups, readers' clubs are advisable.
Right.
And I think that the book can be read in high school, in the literature subjects programs. You can try also there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, one of the things that's very much impressed me is on Goodreads, how now over 10 years since you published the book, there are still Spanish-speaking readers who will respond to the book and provide, enthusiastic feedback. So this word of mouth kind of understanding of how good this book is, and how, as you said, existential, how so essential, and basic this story is as a human story. And so what's been the response? I mentioned Goodreads, individual readers are still coming forward and praising and providing their feedback on the book. But what's been the general response among Spanish language readers since you released the book?
The response was slow, but very positive. Came from recommendation of individual readers, was made between readers one by one. It was the book with the most unanimous praise of our publishing house, and we published almost 100 books. Many readers put Gentleman Overboard as one of their favorite books of their lives. Very few people did not like it.
Right.
I remember some opinions of the readers. Very gripping, impossible to let go. I read it in a few hours. It conveys anguish, hope, comedy, a story that touches the depths of a person, when Gentleman Overboard came out in Spanish in 2010, Instagram was just showing up. Today, Instagram, I think, is the best source for readers to transmit their impressions of readers, their reviews. Also Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
I think this novel is special for literature blogs, book clubs, and to be recommended by booksellers in bookstores. We have many bookstores in Buenos Aires, and the work of the booksellers recommending Gentleman Overboard was awesome.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, yes. 4 or 5 years ago, 2 people told me that they had adapted Gentleman Overboard to take it to the theater. This place was never released, but it's a beautiful possibility for the future.
Absolutely.
Yes. Finally, I would like to say that for my publishing house, Gentleman Overboard is a kind of model that guide the searching for new books to publish. But the truth is that this novel is very unique, and in 10 years, we had never found anything like it.
That's remarkable. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And this is our edition.
Absolutely. Such a beautiful cover you came up
Yes.
with there.
Yes, and this is your new.
Yeah, I mean, it's I certainly the cover design, I have to say. And if you could remind us who designed the cover for that book?
Yes, Juan Pablo Cambariere. He makes all the covers of our publishing house.
But it's superb. I mean, that one in particular I love. But I have to say, having seen many of the releases from La Bestia, they're just wonderful books to look at on their own, which helps a lot, of course.
Yes, very simple, but it represents the book.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Diego, for talking with us today about the Gentleman Overboard. And let's hope that this launch here in the English language edition, first time in over 80 years, we can get it out there to readers, that has a mutual reinforcing effect. And I can say on behalf of Nathan Hamilton, the director of our University Press project here, that we're certainly eager to see if there might be projects in future that we can cooperate with small presses in other languages like La Bestia on. So if you have any suggestions for our recovered book series, we'd certainly be interested in looking to those. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for that interview. For Diego, and we are hoping in the future in the roadmap for recovered books that we can have some collaborations with publishers from other languages, because looks like there are a number of opportunities we have. In fact, literally just 2 days ago, we got an inquiry from an Italian publisher looking at a possibility of issuing an Italian translation of Gentleman Overboard. So I'd like to now introduce my two readers, my two guinea pigs who agreed to participate in this discussion. We have the writer Paul Willits, author of a number of books, including Rendezvous at the Russian Tea Room, King Kong, not Kong, and also author of Members Only, which was filmed in 2013 as a movie starring Steve Coogan called The Look of Love, and Gavin Walcher from the city of Billings, who's the chief librarian for the city libraries and archives of the city of Billings, and also one of the most enthusiastic folks in book Twitter. So if you guys could go off mute, and I'll start by asking you a quick question. If we can see your videos too. Great. Thank you. Well, welcome, Gavin and Paul. For both of you, I sent this book to you essentially completely cold. You knew nothing much about it. You didn't know anything about the Herbert Lewis's story. So tell us a little bit, what was your reaction? I mean, what kind of expectations did you have when you started the book, and what were your reactions when you finished it?
Well, I'll jump in and reply. It was nice, actually. I find it refreshing not to have massive expectations in one direction or other, because I'm sure this has always been true, but you come across so many books that are hyped, and none of us are immune to that sort of hype. And frequently I find myself surrendering to it and wishing I hadn't, and just thinking, this is such and such a book's been vastly overpriced. So it was nice to approach something in a neutral, or just very open way. And yeah, it was lovely, really. And such a pleasant. Well, I wasn't surprised, because you were so enthusiastic about it, and so that encouraged me. And I just naturally sank into the book, rather like the poor guy sinks into the sea, just drops off the end of the ship.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it was a lovely, lovely surprise. It reminded me slightly when you were earlier discussing how natural it is about his life passing before him as he's floating around. This may seem a bit of an odd connection, but a book that's not in I was reminded in structure, in a way, of something that's not in this category of very obscure book, but it's just a bit obscure, which is the John Hersey, The War Lover. And that about the 8th Air Force flying out of East Anglia during the Second World War. And that's a single, so it's got this present tense element of the narrative where the narrator is in a plane with these crewmates, and he's encountering things as they fly along out of East Anglia across the Channel, but punctuating it passages about the rest of his life and his thoughts about what's happened recently. And it struck me as there was a sort of similarity to Gentleman Overboard in that respect, that was less integrated, because Gentleman Overboard's very elegantly done in the sense that there aren't great divides just going from present to past, present to past.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that's the more I've read this book, and I hope that we just had a fire truck go by here. The more I've read this book, the more admiration I have for how well it's constructed. There really is not much in the way of extraneous material. Everything belongs, and it's just enough. Gavin, what did you think? Because I fired, this was really kind of out of the blue for you, wasn't it?
It was, and I followed your blog for over a decade now, and so when you reached out and you asked to send it, I was confident that it was going to be a pretty good read. I haven't found one on your site yet that I haven't enjoyed, but I really didn't know anything about this book. And the one thing that really grabbed me was how strong the narrative was. And the narrative and the situation itself are in such juxtaposition of each other, because here you have Mr. Standish in the ocean, probably not going to survive. And you know that pretty early on in the novel. And yet the narrative, the voice, it's smooth. It's almost glass-like, if we can, and it was unnerving in a way. This was a very disquieting horror novel in a way that I really connected to. And so I read it with great enthusiasm, and I've reread it 3 times since. And every time I've reread it, there is something new that just blows my mind of how the heck did I not know about this author and or book, because it is a shame that it was forgotten for so long as it has been.
Absolutely. It is a shame. I mean, I'm so thrilled to see it coming back and to see readers responding to it, so openly, honestly, because I think that's the strength of this book. It's kind of got a timeless story in many ways. We just got a question. What was the name of the John Hersey novel that was mentioned by Paul? It's called The War Lover. War Lover. Also, a pretty darn good movie starring Steve McQueen and Robert Wagner. One of the few times where McQueen actually does some heavy lifting in terms of acting. But yeah, I mean, there is something about there is sort of a genre of this about people being left alone and isolated. Obviously, Robinson Crusoe, Open Water, Silvio Campo's novel The Promise. So when we see there is something about this situation of somebody being isolated and cut off for their life that seems to be something that people respond to. Did you see that? I mean, do you see this fitting into that kind of even we might say classical literature?
I do. Yeah, I think that there's a place for this novella in that larger scope. I think that the difference of some of those, and you can even put Lord of the Flies in that category, right? Although it's a group of people, there's that hope of survival. This one, there's really not that hope of survival because he's really isolated. So it's a great change of wondering where are we going with this? How reflective can he be throughout the rest of the novel? As you know, things are not going to end well for him.
Right.
And so.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the folks watching on a live stream pointed out, brought up William Golding's novel, Pincher Martin, which is similar in a sense of that you have somebody who is treading water, so to speak. Although in Martin's case, he doesn't. We the reader and he the protagonist, neither one of us really understands that he's been dead all the way through the book. But as you point out, I mean, Standish is in effect a dead man. It's just a matter of time. So this kind of is, I mean, a number of folks, not critics, when they write about this, use the term existential. I mean, would you say that this belongs? I mean, do you see this as on a shelf with something like Camus' The Stranger and other famous existentialist works?
I suppose it has a lot in common with those, but it's so subtle, isn't it? Because it's one of those books, as we were discussing before going live, there's something about you can read all sorts of, as Gavin was saying before we went live, there are other things, there are things about the history of the period in which it was written. I thought it was perceptive even point, which Gavin ought to expand on in a sec. But I think you can read all sorts of things into that situation. You can see contemporary resonances, contemporary for us now, for the author.
Right.
So I'd love to hear more from what Gavin was saying, about the period. I thought that was a very interesting point.
Yeah, I think that, it was written in 1937 or published in 1937. And so arguably Lewis is writing over the period of 35, 36. In the United States during this time, we are still in the holds of a depression. We have new social programs that we really don't know how they're working. We're trying to get men back to work specifically. We're trying to feed families, but it's larger than just our country in the way of this existential crisis. Because worldwide now, over in Asia, you have Japan and China are have their feud is escalating. That will come to the next stages of that horrible cataclysmic event. But then over in Germany, you have Hitler, who is amassing power during this time. And so you could say it's not only a novel of existential crisis for poor Standish, who is in the water, but Lewis is really holding up the mirror, possibly in a larger context to the world. And to me, that didn't actually come into play until my third rereading of it, where I realized he's talking much in a larger sense not just of poor Standish by himself. It's the world at large. We are as a world, we were in an existential crisis of what is going on. Where are these power lies? Now, what's really kind of, maybe this is a stretch to say this, but so you've recovered this book after what the United States has experienced the last 4 years. We have a worldwide pandemic again, and you could almost make the argument that we are again in a worldwide existential crisis of who are we? Where are our alliances? Who's in power? Who do we trust? Who can we go to? And so I think it's really amazing that message, it's still not only relevant today, but arguably is probably going to be relevant in 50 years from now or 100 years from now as geopolitics change, as countries' histories change. And so it's a very powerful, perceptive tool that Lewis used while trying to explain Standish.
I think just to add, continuing from that, I think going to the other extreme from something really global and political to something very individual. One point that occurred to me as I was on that initial reading about it, which was so impressive, and it didn't occur to me until I read your afterward, really fantastic afterward, Brian, was about Herbert Clyde Lewis's working class immigrant background. And I thought that was the fact that he'd written about a guy, Standish, who's from a totally alien background to him, who's an American blue blood. And he wrote about him with such empathy. And I think it would have been, given that he was accused of being a Marxist, and that he'd come from this very tough New York background, he would have been entitled really to criticize this guy and treat this guy as a type in the way that even someone like the British writer Patrick Hamilton, who was a Marxist, and for all the amazing sort of attention he conveyed, Patrick Hamilton even conveys people's mannerisms and speech patterns and individuality. They're nonetheless types, and I never felt that Standish is a type. He's very, very individual, and despite his wealth and all sorts of aspects of privilege, he was treated with great sympathy. It's just it's a work of great humanity.
I completely agree. And I think that's a wonderful point, which is, if you think about the kinds of fiction that were being, and particularly activist fiction that was coming out in the 30s, the rich were portrayed as, very stereotypical. And, Preston Standish has fears, he has doubts, he has, all of these issues that he faces as he's kind of revisiting his life. But even in the context of, Lewis's kind of premise that starts this all off, which is one day he's sitting in his office and he just kind of has at that moment, even before he's fallen off the ship, before he's even left New York and he's left his family and left his job to kind of go out in search of, in fact, he doesn't know what he's looking for. There's a message that comes to him that says, you must leave, you must go. And so I think, to me, that's, I think, one of the most brilliant choices that Lewis made in writing the book was to put himself in the figure of somebody who would have been believed to be essentially the epitome of security and the American establishment. I mean, especially in those days, the American establishment existed in New York and Boston, and to a much lesser extent in Washington, D.C. So he was kind of exactly of that period, but he still comes off as an individual. And I think also Gavin pointed out another thing that I found interesting. One of the comments that a person made on my website not long after I wrote about the book was to talk about the analogies between Standish's situation and the situation of somebody, for example, gets a diagnosis that they have a life-threatening disease, and then suddenly, all the underpinnings go away. And, it seems like in the last year with the pandemic, we're all much more attuned to the reality of that, of how close that situation can be for any of us. And then on top of it, with lockdown of people having to shut themselves away, this book's message about isolation, et cetera, seems to be all the more resonant.
Absolutely. And I would even go one step further and say that for some people, the lifelines were literally taken away, right? They, you know, whether it was family or if it was medicine or if it was employment or what have you, they were taken away, and they had to literally figure it out, how to put food on the table, how to put keep clothes on their back, shelter over their heads, which that's horrible in itself for a family. Now magnify that globally. And that's a very powerful thought of just the impact of this one event.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, I think one of the other things I would like to, I'd like to just check with both of you is to be bluntly practical. I think one of the strengths of this book is it is a book that you can sit down and read in one sitting. You can read it in an evening, start to finish, and grasp the whole thing, which of course, obviously it's because it's probably more of a novella than a novel, but I think that's one of, at least to me, it seems like that's one of the things that that ought to broaden its appeal to a wide base of readers.
Yes, I think especially in these days of fiction that's overblown, or non-fiction for that matter, that can be vastly expanded beyond its natural length. You see that in all sorts of aspects of culture, don't you? In the streaming services, unlike a cinema release, where the cinemas were always on at the movie producers to not extend to over a certain length of time, so they could get several showings in a day and sell ice creams and things. A similar thing almost seems to be going on with books.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's long enough, it tells a full story. But as your afterwards states, there were some that say it wasn't developed enough. There were some that say it's too long. And the weird thing is, I agree with both arguments that it could have been developed more, or it could have been shaved by 60 pages and made a really phenomenal short story. So, but you're absolutely right. You can read this in one sitting. But it's one that I would encourage. Read it in one sitting the first time, and then read it chapter by chapter, one chapter a day is the second way I read it, and it was so much richer doing it that way.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
The short chapters are a great advantage as well. So it creates a sense of narrative movement as it cuts back and forth between his thoughts and his immediate predicament, and which is something I didn't mention that I probably should have done, which earlier in to do with the characterization, which I thought was nice, was that slightly stiff prose style really reflects, it's in perfect sync with the character of Standish, of that very emotionally kind of buttoned up man.
Right.
And it makes it more emotional, really, for the fact that it's so understated.
It's interesting. Several of the British reviewers made the same point that Gavin did, which is that sort of detached critical voice that Lewis writes through becomes almost painful towards the end when it becomes so obvious what Standish's fate is.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
But I think that's the comedy of it all. That's where, we have one of two choices. We can laugh at the absurdity, or we can cry with Standish. And as a reader, we get the luxury of laughing at him because we're not in that situation. And I think that's that's just brilliant on Lewis's part.
I have to say, I'm on the other side. The more times I've read this book, the harder, I mean, there's a point where, you know, he literally talks about Standish's heart breaking. And, you know, after the third or fourth time of reading this book, when I hit that, you know, oh man, it just breaks me too.
Well, and you know, I guess to jump in real quick is the name of the ship is the Arabella, right? And means answered prayer. And that's what prayer was answered. Because at the beginning, Standish wants to have this escape, right? And obviously, I don't think he wanted to end up in the fate that he did, but what prayer was answered, and that's the big mystery that I haven't figured out yet. Why Arabella as the name of the ship?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd never considered that before. It's a great question about that. I think one of the things I like where he has the contrast of essentially how slowly the awareness of his absence, you know, sinks in, how long it takes for people on the ship to become aware that he's gone. To me, that there's so much of a parallel of today's environment where we do, you know, we know people through social media and through email and things like that, and in that environment you can disappear. You know, essentially, if you stop posting, you fall off the ship, so to speak. And you know, if you notice your neighbor doesn't come out of the house day in and day out, you know, you're going to say something's wrong and you'll probably check on it. But in social media, accounts disappear. And I just wonder, you know, how often essentially people fall off the ship in social media environments and nobody notices. So I think that's one of the in some ways, I think that this book probably is more likely to find an audience in today's world than it might have back in the 30s when it first came out. Because I think there are more parallels that can be found with today's world than there might have been true at the time that the book came out.
I think there's also quite an appetite, isn't there, for formal and storytelling novelty that it might well chime with. I hope so, at least.
Yeah, I hope so too as well. Well, we're reaching the end of our time. I guess I'll turn it over back to James. We haven't had many questions coming in, although we're certainly happy to answer them. And as anybody who knows, who follows my website, you know, all you have to do is ask a question. I'm always happy to answer and tip off folks to other books. As mentioned, this is just the start of a recovered book series. So we have a terrific editorial board on board, and we actually have a plan of publication that goes out into 2024. So in May of 23, we'll have 2 books coming out. Just to give you a quick glimpse of them, we have a collection of short stories by the American writer Tess Schlesinger. The New York Review Books Classic brought out her novel, The Unpossessed, a few years ago, but her short story collection, her short stories have been out of print for almost 50 years. And we're including in this collection a number of previously uncollected magazine fiction that she wrote. And then the second book is a true oddity. Paul, you might like this one. It's called, it's by the English writer Stella Benson, and it's called Pull Devil, Pull Baker. And I think it is probably one of the oddest books we're likely to bring out in this series. It is the memoirs written verbatim, so with all grammatical errors and jargon, etc., of a Russian expat nobleman that Benson met in a pauper's hospital in Shanghai, China, in the early 30s. But it's also accompanied with her commentary upon his recollections. And in many ways, it's kind of like it's almost postmodernist in its questioning about what what's the reality of anybody's memory, and how can we trust these things, and what's the truth in any book. So it's a fascinating book, but I'm sure it will take some help to kind of get it over the hump with readers. And with that, I'll turn it back over to James if you want to usher us out.
Thanks very much, Brad. Wow, there's so much in that. That was so fascinating. Thanks so much. It was such a treat, and thanks so much to everyone who's attended as well. I hope you all enjoyed today's event as much as I have. So all that's left to say is many thanks again to our panel, to Brad, to Diego there, to Paul and Gavin, for sharing their expertise and thoughts about Gentlemen Overboard, which, as a quick reminder, is now available to order on our website, which is www.boilerhouse.press. And it also makes a perfect Christmas gift. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for the upcoming Recovered Books titles. And all that's left to say is thanks very much and all the very best. Goodbye from all of us at Boiler House Press.